Well, I think Parliamentary Review does something very interesting. It provides a platform for people to share and express their views, and I hope we're going to be able to build on that even more so that people can interconnect with each other. But it also gives an opportunity for parliamentarians to know that people are taking interest in what they're doing and how they're doing it.
Hello and welcome to the Parliamentary Review podcast, the podcast that puts leadership centre stage. I'm Jonathan White, and in each episode we'll discuss the political and economic goings-on in the country with directors, CEOs, CFOs, government ministers, chairmen, presidents, maybe one day even the Queen. Our aim is to discover who these people are, the people who get up in the morning and make Britain work. We learn about executive decisions, the corporate visions, and of course the innovation and success that make it all worthwhile in the end. Later on in this episode, you'll have the chance to hear our exclusive interview with Lord Blunkett, the former Home Secretary, former Education Secretary, and of course the co-chairman of the Parliamentary Review. But for now, we're joined by David Gadsby, the co-owner of Spirotech Group, a highly successful engineering company that services everything from the food and drink sector to the aerospace industry. Based in Cambridgeshire, the firm was founded in the 1970s, a time when the country struggled with political leadership and had a decade-long debate about membership of the common market. How times have changed. Today, following the company's takeover by David and his brother Russell in 2005, the business has grown with centres in Aberdeen and York, employs about 75 people, and has become a superb example for British exporters. David, welcome.
Good morning, Jonathan. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thanks very much for coming on. And perhaps to begin with, I know our listeners would love to know, actually, what it is yourself and Spirotech have been up to since you appeared in the review in September.
Well, it's been very busy. In fact, overly busy. Well, in the age-old thing, you can never be too busy. We received quite a few export orders for the European market, which was at the time unusual, leading into the Brexit saga, but there we are. Generally, we've increased our month-on-month turnover significantly from about between 8 and 12% up to this period now.
Fantastic. And I think I'm finished. So what ratio is it? I know that Spirotech has a great tradition of export. What ratio is it between your exports to the European market and beyond that?
It's very difficult to quantify because it's always a snapshot in time on exports. But for argument's sake, last month and this month, we are probably looking at 75%.
Fantastic. So obviously you do have a reputation for, I should say, banging the drum of British engineering, and your international business is fairly well established. And how's that overseas growth affected the business domestically this year?
Domestically, it puts a strain on our capacity only, which we are addressing. But on the whole, the UK market just seemed remarkably strong and is increasing in all areas that we are working within.
And I think it's fair to say it's not something perhaps a lot of people would have been expected to be saying 12, 14 months ago.
I don't think anyone expected the level of manufacturing to potentially be where it is at present. Obviously, the large-scale manufacturing in the automotive industry, I think, was predicted to drop off, which it has. But more on the generalised bespoke engineering, it seems to have increased massively.
I think I'm right in saying that the last set of ONS figures showed that for manufacturers, one of the best, the best quarter since 1988, I think factory output up 2.2%. Which certainly was surprising, although perhaps I think it's also fair to say an amount of uncertainty remains. You work across so many sectors with what you do, David. Is there a sense of nervousness about the future?
There is probably a degree of apprehension, nervousness. I don't know. I think most industries that we work within now have taken a very pragmatic view of whatever will happen. They can't influence it, so they just need to carry on with their business as usual.
Absolutely. And I know that with all that in mind, looking towards the next 12 months, bar the political uncertainty, which I think we'll perhaps discuss later, but what's the plan for the business going forward?
Well, over the next 12 to 24, I have to mention the 24 months, we will be moving to a larger manufacturing facility within a mile of our current location, which we obtained planning for, and now we're starting to break ground.
Superb. I know that was something in September you were looking at, so that's great news. Yes, yeah,
we're all very pleased here. It'll allow us to increase our production and manufacture more of what our customers seem to want, and expand within the markets overseas that we've sort of highlighted within our growth strategy.
Excellent. And I think one of the bigger challenges for firms in your sector is certainly the skills necessary going forward with new members of staff. I know you do have a reputation for building on engineering education previously acquired at college and university, but there has been concern about the skills gap more broadly in the workforce. How have you been finding this?
Well, that is one area that we will be addressing with our own training centre, because it is a big problem for the manufacturing industry, where the skills are not being developed. I don't know whether it's an educational thing where the younger generation do not want to go into the manufacturing industry, or if they do, they want to target the higher end side of things. But we are addressing that with our own training centre, because we've seen the drop-off of facilities available to push the core skills, the manufacturing core skills within the UK.
Certainly a pressing issue. I know the government has made quite a big fuss of obviously their T-level programme, and I think at the spring budget last gone, the Chancellor promised another £500 million for it, but a lot of analysis does suggest that it simply isn't enough. And it sounds like, of course, you're doing it, but it will fall to a lot of businesses to really fill the gaps in themselves. Have you found there's much interest from the younger generation in applying themselves to doing what you do?
Again, it's a double-edged sword with the younger generation. Once you've engaged with them and you've actually walked them through what opportunities there are within manufacturing, then the interest level does increase massively. But from a front-end, face-to-face conversation, no, they're not really aware of what goes on within the industry.
I think
so. It's a base level education.
It's spot on. I think it's not they wouldn't be interested, but from a young age they just don't get the exposure to it in the schools, and so if you're not exposed to it, I suppose there's naturally not going to be an interest for it. And I know that's something certainly at the review we'll be talking about in the coming months as well. I recall in your original piece, in fact, that you talked about how essential it was that the UK gets a trade and free movement of people agreement with the European Union in order not to restrict further growth in the economy. At present, I think it's fair to say that not a lot of people would put a lot of money on that being the case. If it isn't, and if we do leave the European Union without those two things, what sort of impact do you think that will have in the short term and perhaps a little longer going forward?
Well, short term, no one really knows. We spoke to some of our workforce from those countries, and they do all imply that they will be staying. So I don't think there'll be initial mass exodus. It will be on expansion, where there will be a problem. And this is where we've looked at going into the local colleges and speaking with the younger generation and engaging them and trying to get them to come in after they've finished their courses, or following through their courses whilst working with us. So it's something we are looking at, but it's a bit of we don't know yet.
Quite, and I think it's certainly going to require the imagination of an awful lot of leaders of business around the country in dealing with it, because there perhaps might not be I know Lord Blunkett discusses it later, but there is perhaps a unique time in recent British political history where there has been perhaps a little lack of leadership when we needed it most. From all sides, and I don't know how obviously you'll speak in your own business circles. Is that opinion reflected with who you talk to?
Yes, absolutely. It seems to be the general sense of opinion to everyone I talk to, not just a few, but everyone.
It's quite a universally held thing, and it's. I think anyone would be lying to suggest that they would know. I think how that will be resolved any time soon.
It's between the devil and the deep blue sea. You're never going to please everyone, but from my point of view and from our business's point of view, we need the one key area, or the two key areas, and that's a customs union and ideally free movement of people.
I know a lot of people in the business world feel like that as well, although I think we also all know that there's going to have to be some degree of compromise. And obviously, politically, I don't think the government can deliver probably maybe none of those things. In terms of, and perhaps this is more fun, but if you were Secretary of State for the day, David, what is it you would policy-wise impose? What can the government do really to help at the moment?
That's a $1 million question, isn't it? I don't really know. As you say, there's compromise. Will have to be forthcoming. Compromise on what? Does it satisfy all parties? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
The two key areas that we would like to see were what I've just said. That's the free movement of people, or an imposed restriction, but not a full block on the free movement of people.
But I think there is perhaps a thought that I think politically, again, it might be unacceptable to continue with free movement, but there might be a good compromise in quite a liberal visa program, especially when it comes to workers coming here. And I think that may well be the compromise, and I think that might satisfy quite a lot of people. Not perfect for anyone, by no means, but satisfactory. And you've been in business for decades, and certainly you've seen governments come and go. You've seen regulations change at sometimes a rapid, sometimes a glacial pace. But you've made a very big success of it, and I think the listeners, especially younger people, perhaps like to know what have been your guiding principles over the year in getting to where you are today.
Difficult one again. Just believe in what you're doing and carry on. And it's all down to hard work. If you put it in, you'll get it back out. The problem we've had in the UK over the last 10 years has been legislation and the binding of legislation. We appear to be the only European country that adheres to 100% of legislation issued within the European Union.
Yes.
That doesn't apply elsewhere. So to a certain degree, you have to be able to wriggle your way through it and pick out the pieces that matter and ignore what you can to a certain degree.
Right,
so I'm not advocating anyone ignore all legislation.
Of course. But I know exactly what you mean, and I know what you mean. That you go to France, and certainly some of the biggest proponents of extra legislation. But by gosh, are they good at ignoring it as well? And I think certainly what you mean is that we need to be as practical as possible. in applying laws. I would hope that perhaps then one of the advantages of, if indeed perhaps when and if we leave the European Union, there might be a case where we'll be able to apply more practical laws to this country, rather than having these blanket laws covering the entire continent. But I suppose that's up in the air at the moment. But if you could, let's say, perhaps if you could give the David Gadsby of 20 years ago any advice, what would you say to him now?
I would say to him, listen to as many people as you can, and don't ignore any piece of advice that anyone gives you. You don't know it all.
And I think not only is that exceptionally good advice and relevant right now, but I think that really does sum up perhaps what has become almost a chasm between business end of this country and the political end of it. You speak to businessmen up and down the country, and they'll really say the same thing. You must listen to people. You must take on advice. You must talk to as many people as possible. And you do rather get the feeling that at the moment some of our political leaders are doing the opposite of that and really sort of boxing themselves in and only talking to one another.
Yes, I agree. I think the political system within the UK at the moment is shining a blinding light on themselves and portraying them to be career politicians only.
Yes, well,
that's a damning indication of our political system.
Absolutely. We're recording this before the European elections, which will be on Thursday, and the polls currently stand at with the Brexit Party, this new party led by Nigel Farage in the lead, and last time I checked, with the Conservative Party either on 4th or 5th place, which would be historic. That the Conservative Party, I think, have never come outside the top 3 in a national election. And I think no matter how you voted, I think what you just said is exactly right, David, and that it is a result of people's frustrations and this gap that's opened up between them and what they see as this professional class of politicians.
Yes, I agree. I mean, as the general populace, it's the only thing left open to them. It's the only power they wield, and that's went to frustration at the ballot box.
Quite absolutely. Now, look, David, it's been a pleasure talking. I think we rattled through quite a lot there, and it was great talking. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll speak again soon.
No problem at all.
Thanks, David.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
I hope you enjoyed our chat there with David. I think we all learned quite a bit there about the engineering sector. The issue of apprenticeships and skills for our young people, something that we will no doubt be revisiting very soon. If you haven't heard it before, coming up now is our conversation with the Parliamentary Review's co-chairman, David Blunkett. Lord Blunkett served as Home Secretary and then Education Secretary in Tony Blair's cabinet before receiving a peerage in 2015. Outside of politics, he's the Vice President of the Royal National Institute of Blind People and the National Alzheimer's Society, and when he has the time, he can be found cheering on his team, Sheffield Wednesday. I hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed speaking to David. Here it is now. We're now joined by Lord Blunkett. Thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Now, it would probably be remiss of me if I didn't start, given the recent events in Parliament. I didn't ask you, given your 32 years in that place, about your thoughts regarding the unprecedented situation I think the public are looking at the minute.
Well, I think I see it very much like Joe Public. I see it as though I'm looking at something that is made up, that is scripted, that is like almost a sci-fi film where anything can happen and then anything does happen. And I'm very sad about that because I think that it's damaged our parliamentary democracy. I think that it's brought politics into disrepute, and I think it's created anger on all sides, whether people were strongly in favour of remaining or whether they were, as we call them, Brexiteers.
Absolutely. And given that situation, whether it's going to be a general election, many people are beginning to worry about how apathy taking effect.
Well, I'm worried about two things. Apathy in the respect of turnout and whether people vote, and anger and, if you like, the friction developed into a failure to be able to have a democratic dialogue, so that the respect that we have for each other, that the way in which we debate issues is often now broken down, and there's abuse in the street, not just of people because they're considered to be different or foreign, but because people recognize they have a different point of view. Now, that is new. I've been around in formal politics now for, goodness, almost all my adult life, because I was elected to a local authority in my city of Sheffield when I was 22. And I've never seen that. I've seen people get very annoyed, and that's fine, and people should get angry, but I've never experienced them display it in such personal venom before. And we need to calm that, because our democracy depends on people being able to have genuine disagreements and differences and to work them through the political process. Otherwise, we fall, as history teaches us, into the hands of extremists.
Absolutely. And given that you've just said what you just said, a lot of people are talking now about whether the party structure, which does exist at the minute, it can survive. We've seen both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party showing signs of buckling.
I think the political system the party system will survive. It may have a very rocky time in the near future, but I think it'll right itself. But it will only do that if political parties themselves sort out what's going on internally. I think both major parties have been, to use an old phrase, infiltrated. Came across a prominent minister just outside the cabinet whose current chair of their Conservative Association was the UKIP candidate against him back in 2015. We know about the challenges within the Labour Party and the way in which people who were thrown out of the party have either been able to or are seeking to rejoin. And so we've got this two-ender, if you like, the bread in the two sides of the sandwich coming together, and the middle is being squeezed. Now, there's academic work to say that actually the electorate aren't all that keen on centre parties, particularly at the moment. And I think we need to be wary of believing that the creation of some sort of centrist party in Britain would solve the problem. It would temporarily, but it wouldn't resolve the differences that people have and how we work them through.
A lot of people have been suggesting recently that the only way out of this situation is with a second referendum. And I write in saying that you have quite reluctantly come to that position yourself.
It took me a very long time to come to the conclusion that we would need an affirmative vote. I resisted it because I come from and represented an area deeply disaffected, feeling the effects of deindustrialization and then the austerity measures on the back of the global meltdown, and felt in my bones, which is why I wasn't one of those who thought we were easily going to win the referendum for Remain in 2016, that you need to deal with the underlying problems and causes of that disaffection. And the simple slogan, "They didn't hear you the first time, tell them again," could be very effective, a kind of Trumpian slogan that could be adopted by those who are very, very vehement Brexiteers. However, I think given the state that we're in, I came to the conclusion a few weeks ago, and I wrote in the Daily Telegraph, that I think the only way to deal with this is to get an agreement for this interim period, because that's what it is, a transition from where we are to where we might be, and then put that to the British people. And if the British people don't like that negotiated agreement, either Theresa May's original or something that emerges from the discussions and the debate and the toing and froing between the two major parties, put that to the electorate and give them a chance 3 years on from 2016 to make a new choice as to whether that's what they want to go for, that's the direction they want to take, or whether they'd like to take a step back and remain in the European Union.
And do you think that the people of Sheffield that did vote leave, many of whom voting for the first time in decades or the first time ever, do you think that they would feel maybe slightly frustrated at the call for a second vote?
Yes, I think they would. And I think we just have to be really honest about that. There would be a great deal of frustration, bordering on anger, people saying, we gave you the message, why didn't you just do it? And we have to be straight with them. The reason it's been complex, the reason it's taken this time, the reason that we are in the undoubted mess we're in, is because it wasn't simple. You didn't, as some people thought, sign a bit of paper and walk away. This is a complex, interconnected, economically, socially, in terms of our trade and our relationships, not just within the European Union, but with the European Union's agreements across the world. This is a complex issue. And to pretend otherwise is not to give people what they want, it's to patronize them and say, yes, we don't think you were wrong. We don't think that you got it wrong when you thought it was a simple way out. I think you just have to be straight with them, and they'll be angry. I mean, people are angry with me when I walk around in my own constituency and say, what are you up to? And I say, I'm up to trying to speak the truth. I'm up to trying to say it as it is, as I always have done.
Absolutely. Now, given all of that, one would expect the governing party to perhaps be somewhere between 20 points and to 30 points behind the opinion polls, but they are not. And there has been an awful lot of criticism of the leadership of the opposition regarding that. Would you have any advice for the leadership of your party?
Well, I think belatedly, from the beginning of April, the two parties realised that they were going to sink separately if they didn't actually try and make an effort and at least display some endeavour to work together. I think had there been two different leaders post-2016 referendum, this would have happened a great deal earlier. It hasn't, but it can now. And it is remarkable that in the circumstances that the government have found themselves, not just in not being able to get the kind of deal that some people wanted, not even being able to hold all their party together, but actually being totally riven publicly with cabinet responsibility having broken down, to find themselves only marginally behind, or even on opinion polls through March, marginally in front of the Labour Party, is astonishing. And once this period is over, I think Labour will need to take a very long, hard look at why the British people have not turned, as they often do, to what is called Her Majesty's opposition. There are very complex reasons for that, including the fact that the leadership of the party have only realised, I think, very, very recently, that you have to reach out to people whose views you don't agree with, and you have to win them over to something more than what the issues and the policies and the ideology you thought of in the first place.
And on that point, you'll be aware, certainly, that the Parliamentary Review itself has been dedicated to showcasing leadership in all its forms across the country. Now, speaking to many of our contributors, they have made clear that they do feel that leadership has been lacking, both from the government and opposition, as you've said. In your many years in politics, is there a time in certainly recent history where there has been perhaps a leadership vacuum like we're seeing today?
I think we find in Britain an interesting paradox. People want strong leaders, but they want leaders that listen and are responsive. And the two don't always go together. I've lived through the period of both Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair, two leaders who knew what they wanted to do and were prepared to put it on the line. I've lived through Ted Heath and John Major, who were less clear. Ted Heath on Europe, yes, but not on much else. John Major really trying to mop up after the controversial and divisive Thatcher era. where they showed a different style of leadership. Now, they were portrayed as being weak. I don't think that's always the case. I think that you can have leaders who are very clear what they want to do, but to turn on its head the Marxist slogan, speak softly and walk with a big stick, they can actually do the job clearly and decisively. Clem Attlee was such a person, and in many ways so is Harold Macmillan. And those are the kind of leaders where you don't get bombast, you don't get, I know best and I'm going to push this through, but you actually get someone who can genuinely create a coalition of the willing, but has a clear idea about their values. And I hope we'll return to that.
Absolutely. And I think one of the strengths of the review has always been its sense of bipartisanship. Well,
I think Parliamentary Review does something very interesting. It provides a platform for people to share and express their views, and I hope we're going to be able to build on that even more so that people can interconnect with each other. But it also gives an opportunity for parliamentarians to know that people are taking interest in what they're doing and how they're doing it, and therefore to get the message that they've got to reflect outwards. We need both. We need the input into the system. We need voices. We need ideas. We need experiences through Parliamentary Review inwards, but we also need to ensure that the way in which our politics works is reflected outwards, so that people firstly understand how the system works, secondly, the complexity and difficulty of it, and thirdly, the way in which they need to tell us, I mean, I'm in the upper house now, but to tell us as parliamentarians what they think and where we're going wrong, and for us to listen.
Absolutely. And on that point, you've been in public service most of your life, Lord Blunkett, ever since Sheffield City Council. In that time, what are the key lessons you think you've learned in the best way for policymakers and those at the coalface to communicate and work together?
I've learned that actually there is enormous wisdom out there, and if you're prepared to engage and to listen, then your views might actually change. Mine have on a number of issues, particularly social issues, what small L liberal issues over the years, going in the opposite direction, it has to be said, to most people as they age. And you need to ensure that you've reached out to sufficient people to create that coalition that allows you to make progress, and that you won't create everything you want and change everything you want for the better overnight. It will never happen. There's no days where everything's done and we can all wash our hands of it and that's fine. We build building blocks. We stand, if you like, historically on the shoulders of those who came before us. And if we get that message, we won't be too frustrated when everything doesn't happen immediately, but we'll be determined to make progress, and we'll punish politically, democratically, those who don't.
Absolutely. And perhaps finally, with that concluding point, it's fair to say, as you've already mentioned, a lot of the population are frustrated, no matter how they vote in the referendum or their general political opinions. But perhaps, for those people, is there something you'd point to be optimistic, looking towards the future about?
I think I'm very clear. We're a great nation. We can't just do things on our own. We have to recognise that we live in an incredibly rapidly growing global environment, and the power sources and the power politically has changed over the last 20, 30 years. But we are creative, we are innovative, and we will pull through, and we'll do it because we won't have anyone else to blame anymore if we come out of the European Union, and we'll need to literally pull our socks up and do it ourselves. In the end, my message is clear. Nothing is ever as good as it seems at the time, and nothing is ever as bad. And we've come through difficult times in the past, and we'll come through again.
Lord Blunkett, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan.
A special thanks to our guests David Gadsby and Lord Blunkett for joining us today. As always, it's been a pleasure interviewing and learning from our guests, and I hope you've all enjoyed listening. Until next time, I'm off to the Westminster Arms to raise a glass to raising standards. Goodbye.
Thank you very much for listening to our podcast. You can find every episode on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. If you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Review, please visit our website at www.theparliamentaryreview.co.uk.